It wasn't dramatic, not in the way I thought pain would announce itself. No sharp scream, no collapse, just a strange, unsettling sound, like something brittle giving way under too much pressure. A crack, low and wet, accompanied by a sudden jolt in my knee as I descended the staircase, laundry basket pressed awkwardly against my hip. For a split second, the world tilted. My hand caught the railing, heart skipping, as a heat shot through my leg and settled deep inside the joint. I stood frozen on the step, staring down at my own body, as if waiting for confirmation that something had truly gone wrong. The pain didn't roar. It pulsed, subtle, deliberate, spreading like ink in water. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, something in me already knew. This wasn't just a twist or a pull. This was the kind of injury that lingers, that insists on being acknowledged. That night, I propped my leg on pillows and convinced myself it would pass. Ice packs, ibuprofen, avoidance. But deep down, I sensed I was lying to myself. My body, this familiar terrain I had learned to manage and mask, was no longer cooperating with quiet compromise. The next morning, the stiffness had spread. My movements were slower, careful. I could hear the creak of my knee before I felt it. Standing, sitting, even walking across the kitchen floor became a cautious negotiation. I found myself holding my breath each time I stepped down, waiting to see if the pain would follow. It always did, like a shadow that had learned to attach itself to my rhythm. I called the clinic without really thinking. My husband was out of town. The kids were grown and gone. There was no one to stop me, no one to tell me to wait or tough it out. I made the appointment. The MRI was quick and impersonal. Sterile room, cold metal, disembodied voices through a speaker. I stared at the ceiling as the machine hummed around me, trying not to focus on the thoughts clawing their way up through the quiet. The doctor's voice afterward was calm but certain. Nothing life-threatening. A tear, not a rupture. Manageable. Physiotherapy. Twice a week. I nodded and smiled, grateful for the script of adulting I knew by heart. Listen, accept, move forward. But as I sat alone in the parking lot afterward, my hands clenched around the steering wheel, I realized how heavy my body felt, how empty the car was, how loud silence could be. I didn't expect much from therapy. I imagined a small, crowded room, tired equipment, and a bored professional checking boxes as they coached me through awkward, repetitive motions. I braced myself for discomfort and boredom. What I didn't brace for was her. She entered the room without fanfare, clipboard in hand, dressed in soft athletic wear that clung to her in all the right places. Her steps were deliberate, grounded, like she owned her body completely. When she looked at me, it wasn't with pity or clinical detachment. It was with curiosity, not the prying kind, the kind that sees before understanding. Her presence unsettled me immediately, not because it was invasive, but because it felt like a question I hadn't prepared to answer. I had come in expecting therapy. She made me feel like I'd entered something more intimate, something I didn't have a name for. The evaluation was simple. She asked questions, tested my range of motion, applied light pressure in places that made me wince. But even her touch was different. There was a deliberateness to it, a quiet confidence. Her fingers knew where to go and how to move, not just to diagnose, but to learn. It was as if she read my body like a map she'd studied before. I found myself holding tension in places I hadn't noticed in years, my shoulders, my jaw, the space just beneath my ribs. When she adjusted my leg and placed her palm against the inside of my thigh, it wasn't invasive, but it wasn't neutral either. It felt like a soft intrusion wrapped in clinical necessity, and my body reacted before I could stop it. By the end of the session, my knee throbbed less, but something else had awakened, something low and heavy, humming beneath my skin. I left the clinic walking slower than I'd arrived, Not because of pain, but because I didn't quite trust myself. My body felt altered, as if that strange hunch on the stairs hadn't broken me, but unlocked something I hadn't realized I'd sealed away. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at my leg. The bruising was subtle, the swelling mild, but the heat remained, not just in the joint, but in the surrounding tissue, in the memory of touch. I tried to tell myself it was just proximity, just a body reacting to pain, but I knew the difference. I'd lived long enough to know when something was shifting, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. I slid beneath the sheets and turned off the light, my hand resting gently above the bandaged knee. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of restlessness, not the painful kind, but the kind that reminds you how much of yourself you've stopped exploring. Something had cracked that day, but it wasn't just cartilage. The second session began with familiarity, but beneath it, I felt a ripple of anticipation I couldn't explain away. I told myself it was normal, expected even. After all, she had touched me before, worked on the tender parts of my body in a professional setting. This was routine. This was clinical. But my body didn't agree. As I laid down on the padded table, my breath caught for just a moment, and I felt the fabric of my leggings stretch slightly over my hips as I shifted into position. She adjusted the bolster under my knee and rested a firm hand against the outer side of my thigh. The pressure was measured, but my skin responded with a tingle that bloomed outward like warmth in cold water. She began with familiar movements, slow glides, gentle compressions, all aligned with the goal of restoring strength and balance. But as her hands traveled lower, mapping the muscles that wrapped around my knee, I felt her fingers drift further than before. Not suddenly, not overtly, but with a patience that was almost tender. She pressed her thumb into a point just above my inner knee, then swept downward along the curve of my inner thigh, stopping just short of a place I wasn't prepared to have noticed. My breath stayed steady, but my pulse betrayed me. She explained nothing. There was no warning, only the next movement, the next shift. Her hand slid beneath the hem of my loose shorts, fingers curling lightly under the edge, seeking tension, locating tightness, or at least that's what I told myself. But she didn't stop at the obvious pain points. Her palm rested firmly on the top of my thigh, while her other hand guided my ankle outward, exposing the inner line of my leg, the delicate skin that rarely saw touch. She pressed, released, then returned again, slower, softer. My body pulsed, a deep throb forming in places that had nothing to do with injury. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, and I focused on it as though I could disappear into its sterile hum. But nothing could distract me from the sensation of her thumb tracing the groove between tendon and flesh, just far enough to make my hips tense. She didn't rush. Her touch was deliberate, almost reverent. I wanted to believe it was therapeutic necessity, a maneuver guided by training and anatomy, but my body understood the difference. Her hand hovered at the threshold of something unspoken, and each time it returned, it lingered longer. She adjusted my position again, instructing me to turn slightly onto my side. I complied, feeling the cold of the vinyl table against my bare arm as I shifted. The movement exposed more of my leg. She stood behind me now, one hand supporting my thigh, the other pressing just beneath the curve of my hip. Her fingers slipped lower this time, dipping into the crease where thigh meets pelvis, her knuckles grazing the edge of my underwear. I didn't flinch. I didn't breathe. I only felt a spreading heat, a slow pressure blooming deep in my abdomen, a slick awareness building where her hand hadn't yet touched. There was a moment when her pinky brushed the edge of my skin, just a whisper of contact against the most intimate border of flesh. My thighs tensed involuntarily. She didn't retreat. Instead, her fingers spread slightly, pressing into the tension she claimed to be releasing. But I knew, my body knew, this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just anatomy. This was intention disguised as technique. And I accepted it. Every calculated motion, every second her palm remained lower than it should have. I sank into it, let it wash over me like a forbidden current. I no longer had the strength or will to resist. When she finally stepped back, her hands left ghostly traces on my skin. My body was flushed, my pulse erratic, my breath shallow and uneven. She moved across the room to make notes, the quiet scribble of pen on paper filling the silence between us. I lay still, unsure of how to move, without revealing everything that had just stirred beneath my surface. The air in the room felt thick, perfumed with sweat and something more primal. As I sat up slowly, I caught my reflection in the mirror on the far wall. My face was calm, composed, but my eyes betrayed something else, something raw, awakened, and barely contained. I reached for my water bottle with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. She turned back toward me and offered a subtle nod, not quite a smile. I returned it, just as quiet, just as loaded. The session ended like any other. Small talk, a follow-up scheduled, a polite goodbye. But as I walked out of the building into the harsh daylight, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I no longer cared whether it was ethical, whether it was intentional, whether it was real or imagined. Her hands had crossed a boundary I hadn't known existed, and I had let them, welcomed them, ached for more. In the car, I sat for several minutes before starting the engine. The fabric of my leggings still held the warmth of her touch, and the inside of my thighs tingled where her fingertips had skimmed. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap and saw the faint tremor return. This wasn't about recovery anymore. It wasn't about mobility or strength. It was about sensation, power, control, and the fact that I hadn't said no. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and latex, clinical, clean, but tinged with something warmer, something human. I arrived early this time, earlier than usual, pretending it was traffic or habit, but knowing it was neither. I sat quietly on the padded bench near the window, staring at the muted landscape beyond the glass, but seeing none of it. My pulse already pulsed lightly in my throat. I was aware of my skin before anything had even begun. She walked in without ceremony, clipboard in hand, her expression calm, unreadable. Her hair was pulled back today, and a thin film of sweat clung to her neck, glistening just enough to remind me she had a body too, one that moved and exerted and existed beyond the quiet power of her hands. She greeted me with professional rhythm, all routine and protocol, but I felt the beat underneath, the slight delay in her pause near the door, the way her eyes dragged across my form a moment too long. She gestured toward the table, and I climbed onto it with practiced effort, every movement rehearsed, yet thick with unspoken weight. My leggings slid down to my knees as requested, the cotton of my oversized shirt pooling loosely around my waist. She adjusted the bolster again, positioning my leg with the kind of touch that could be easily explained, but not easily ignored. Her hands found familiar territory, pressing into the muscles above my knee with slow pressure, gliding outward in long, confident strokes. She spoke in clinical tones, naming muscles, noting inflammation, tracing lines of tension like topography etched into my skin. I nodded, feigning interest in the medical jargon, but my mind wandered far from anatomy. My thoughts sank into the warmth of her palms, the sharp awareness that ignited in every place she pressed, especially when she began working higher up, toward the hip, toward the heat. Her fingers pushed into the inner thigh again, further this time, deeper. The pressure was firmer, almost demanding. She held my leg in place, anchoring me, grounding me, while her other hand began to knead the tension that she insisted was impeding my recovery. My body betrayed me quickly, breath shallow, skin damp, thighs trembling slightly with each press of her thumb. I tried to relax, to mimic the ease of passive submission, but the anticipation in my spine gave me away. She shifted my leg outward, opening the angle of my hips subtly, giving herself more access. Her face remained composed, her eyes on the task, but her hands had their own language. She reached with her forearm under my thigh, lifted it slightly, and began a new pattern of movement, small circular motions that drifted toward the junction of muscle and bone, closer, always closer. The contact was veiled, protected by protocol, yet undeniably intimate. I closed my eyes, not to pretend I was elsewhere, but to feel it more clearly. Every inch of her pressure was deliberate, rhythmic, calculated. Sweat began to pool beneath my back where it met the vinyl table. My shirt clung to my stomach. My breathing was audible now, and I knew she could hear it. The room felt smaller, the air thickened by heat, and something rawer, something slipping out of both of us unnoticed. She repositioned herself behind me, resting my leg across her thigh for stability, her skin pressing against mine in a subtle contact that sent shivers through my core. She reached underneath again, fingers sliding along the underside of my thigh until her knuckles brushed the edge of my underwear. I didn't react. I couldn't. My entire body had gone still, in that kind of stillness that contains a storm. The fabric shifted slightly beneath her touch, but she made no attempt to move it. She didn't need to. The proximity was enough. It sent pulses radiating through my pelvis, my breath now uneven and shallow. The sweat was real now. It gathered in the crease of my elbow, slid down my temple, collected beneath my breast where the edge of my bra trapped the heat. She adjusted her position again, applying pressure from a different angle, her forearm brushing the side of my breast with the barest graze. Accidental in appearance, but not in effect. My nipple tightened immediately beneath the cotton, and my legs tensed despite my effort to stay relaxed. She whispered something about pelvic engagement and hip flexors, but the words were distant, muffled, unimportant. My mind was focused entirely on the way her fingers dug into the sensitive tissue near the base of my pelvis, how her breath occasionally fell close to my skin, how the scent of her, clean sweat, subtle shampoo, filled my lungs. Time blurred. I lost track of the minutes, the structure, the routine. All I could feel was movement, hers and mine, synchronized like parts of a slow, controlled burn. When she finally released the tension in my leg and gently laid it down, her hands lingered. Not long, not overtly, just long enough for my skin to remember it, just long enough for my thighs to clench imperceptibly, for my lower belly to flutter in response. She stepped back, scribbled a note on her clipboard, and instructed me to stretch slowly before getting up. I obeyed, my body heavy and dazed, as though I'd surfaced from deep underwater. My hands trembled as I pulled my leggings back over my knees. My face flushed, though I pretended it was from effort. The silence between us as I sat up was thick, humming. Not awkward, but full, of things unspoken, unnamed, untouched. I walked to the door, legs a little shaky, a damp line of sweat tracing the curve of my spine beneath my shirt. She held the door open for me, her expression unreadable again, her hands calmly at her sides. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the cool air kiss my overheated skin, and I knew something irreversible had happened. This was no longer therapy. It hadn't been for a while, and yet we hadn't broken any rules, not officially. Everything remained within the margins of what could be explained, defended, denied. But I knew better. My body knew better. I drove home with the windows down, sweat drying on my back, my thighs still warm from the echo of her touch. I tried not to press my legs together at red lights, tried not to revisit the way her fingers curved just beneath the hem of my underwear. But the sensation lingered, etched into the flesh just below the line of pain, where relief and desire had quietly learned to meet. The dreams began without warning, not vivid at first, more like sensations smeared across sleep, lingering just long enough to stain the edges of my consciousness. I'd wake in the early hours, tangled in sheets, my thighs slick and my breath short, my body buzzing with a memory that wasn't quite real and yet felt too precise to be imagined. Her hands would still be on me in the dream, moving with the same slow confidence they held in the clinic. But in sleep, the layers fell away. There were no clothes, no table, no medical pretense, only her skin against mine, mouths pressed together, her body folding into me with unbearable patience. Each night deepened the ache. I stopped sleeping through till morning. I'd wake with dampness between my legs, a throbbing low in my stomach, my skin flushed as though her hands had just left me. Sometimes my fingers would wander beneath the sheets before I could stop them, seeking some form of release, but it never felt the same. Nothing I did could mimic the way her touch felt, how it slid just below the threshold of what was allowed, how it made me feel unraveled with the barest pressure. I began watching myself more closely, how I moved, how I dressed. I found myself choosing clothes that clung a little tighter, shirts that slipped off one shoulder or skirts that brushed my thighs with just a bit more carelessness. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I didn't recognize the hunger behind my eyes. It wasn't youth I wanted. It wasn't about the age gap or the novelty of attraction. It was her. The precision of her movements, the stillness in her gaze, the way she made my body feel like a question she already knew the answer to. My husband noticed nothing. He'd return home late, exhausted, and half distracted, falling into bed beside me without thought. His hands had grown mechanical over the years, polite, practiced, detached. They lacked the urgency, the curiosity, the heat. I found myself turning away when he touched me, not with rejection, but with disinterest. It felt like a performance I'd outgrown. My body had become fluent in a new language, and his gestures no longer translated. The physical therapy sessions continued, but something between us had changed. We no longer needed excuses. The touches were still cloaked in professional necessity, but they lingered longer now, pressed deeper. When she adjusted my hip, her fingers splayed wider, sliding beneath fabric instead of around it. When she guided my leg through a stretch, her palm cupped the underside of my thigh just a moment longer than required. Her hands remained steady, but her breath gave her away, just slightly quicker when she leaned over me, just a little heavier when her knuckles grazed exposed skin. She never said a word. She never needed to. Her hands did the speaking, and my body listened with shameful readiness. After one particularly charged session, I drove home in silence, windows shut, the air thick with my own scent. I peeled off my clothes as soon as I entered the bedroom, dropped them in a pile on the floor, and sat at the edge of the bed, legs apart, still throbbing from her hands. The mirror caught me in full, naked, flushed, my nipples hard, a glistening wetness between my legs. I stared at myself for a long time. I didn't touch. I didn't move. I just watched, breathing through the weight of the want I could no longer deny. That night, the dream was different. It began in the clinic, the table behind me, the blinds drawn low, But instead of the usual ritual, she stood before me, eyes locked on mine, and began to undress, slowly, one piece at a time. Her shirt lifted over her head, revealing smooth skin and a firm, taut belly. Her bra slipped down her arms, her breasts full and bare in the soft light. Her shorts fell next, then the thin strip of fabric between her legs. She was perfect, confident, unashamed. And then she stepped forward and took my hand, guiding it to her breast, to her waist, to the heat between her thighs. I felt everything. The slickness of her skin, the shiver in her muscles, the breath caught in her throat when I slid my fingers along the tender line of her core. She kissed me in the dream, slow, deep, mouth parting over mine with exquisite patience. My hands were greedy, but she didn't stop me. She pulled me closer, pressed her thigh between mine, and I ground against her until I woke up shaking, wet, and gasping in the dark. The sheets were soaked, my nightshirt clung to my chest, and my hand was buried between my legs, fingers slick and trembling. I lay there in the dark, sweat cooling on my skin, heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilt, only an overwhelming awareness of how far I'd slipped from the life I once inhabited. My body belonged to her now, not in name, not in deed, but in need. The next morning, I opened my underwear drawer and paused. I skipped the practical cotton and reached for something I hadn't worn in years. Black lace, soft and sheer, the kind that whispered intention. I slipped it on beneath my jeans, felt the delicate fabric hug my skin, and stood a little taller. My body felt different, not younger, not tighter, but awake. As I left the house, the air felt thicker somehow, the sunlight too bright. I walked slower. I noticed the movement of my hips, the swing of my step, and beneath it all, the dampness that hadn't entirely left me, a secret I carried with every breath. I wasn't healing anymore. I was unraveling, and I wanted her to finish the job. The house felt too quiet the night I invited her in. The walls, once familiar, now pulsed with something foreign, something electric that had followed me home like the echo of her touch. I had lit candles without thinking, not for scent or light, but for softness, for the way shadows move across skin and blur the line between fear and desire. My hands trembled slightly as I filled 2 glasses with wine, the clink of ice betraying the nerves I couldn't silence. I wore silk, not much, just enough to let the fabric slide across my body like memory. My heart had been beating in my throat all day. When the door opened and she stepped inside, everything slowed. She was in black, leggings, a loose top, her hair damp from a shower, smelling faintly of eucalyptus and sweat. She looked at me as though nothing about this moment was strange. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes, they lingered. On my collarbone, on the swell of my chest, on the way the hem of my robe fell open slightly with each breath. She set her bag down gently, and the silence between us filled every room. We sat on the couch for a while, knees brushing, fingers too close on the stem of a wine glass. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The tension had ripened into something ripe and full, too heavy for words. When I stood and reached for her hand, she followed. My bedroom was dim and cool. The bed turned down like an invitation I wasn't brave enough to voice, but my body moved ahead of my fear. I slipped the robe from my shoulders, letting it fall, and stood before her in nothing but the soft shimmer of fabric and skin. She stepped closer, reached for my waist, and kissed me with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing the outcome. Her mouth was slow, her hands decisive. When she pulled the straps from my shoulders, they slid down with the sound of silk against skin, and I felt her eyes roam my body with reverence and hunger. I didn't shy away. I had waited too long to be touched like this. She guided me back onto the bed, climbing over me with grace, her thighs straddling mine, her breath hot against my chest. She kissed me slowly, neck, collarbone, breast, each press of her lips a promise, each stroke of her tongue a confession. I arched into her touch, gasping softly when her hand slid between my thighs and cupped me through the lace. Her fingers were warm and sure, moving in slow circles that left me trembling. I felt myself unravel beneath her, piece by piece, until I was nothing but breath and skin. When her fingers slipped inside me, I cried out, the sound raw, broken open. She moved with precision, with rhythm, her other hand splayed across my stomach, anchoring me. I clung to her with everything I had, fingers digging into her arms, legs wrapped around her hips, heart pounding hard enough to shake the bed. When I came, it was with a force that left me breathless, mouth open in silent disbelief. She didn't stop. She kissed me again, deeper now, and I tasted myself on her lips. Later, I lay on my side, curled against her, her arm draped over my waist. My fingers traced idle circles across her stomach, slick with sweat. I should have felt peace. I should have felt clarity. But something in her stillness unsettled me. Not guilt, not shame, but distance. She was there, her body warm against mine, but part of her felt elsewhere, watching, calculating, waiting. I sat up, reaching for the water glass on the nightstand, and when I turned, I saw her watching me. Not tender, not vulnerable, something colder. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She reached across me, opened the drawer beside my bed, and began pulling things out. My lip balm, a roll of receipts, the small velvet box where I kept earrings. She turned it over, opened it, and examined the contents without asking. Confusion crept in. My pulse picked up again, but not from arousal this time. She pulled out a second drawer and found the passport folder. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently. I asked nothing, said nothing. I only watched, paralyzed by a sudden weight pressing against my chest. Her fingers flipped through my documents, my husband's, a copy of our marriage license, our emergency contacts. She took her time. Then she stood, naked still, calm as breath, and gathered her clothes from the chair. I sat motionless on the bed, heart racing now in an entirely different way. She moved with the same quiet grace I had once found so alluring, but now it felt clinical, surgical, as if she had finished a procedure and was preparing to dispose of the patient. She dressed in silence, not hurried, not shameful, just detached. When she turned to leave, she looked at me with something like pity, or perhaps contempt, or maybe just boredom. I couldn't tell. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to scream, accuse, demand answers. But my mouth was dry, my voice missing. I was naked and sweating in a room that smelt like sex and betrayal. The door closed behind her. I sat there for a long time, knees pulled to my chest, sheets tangled around my legs, the warmth of her body fading from the mattress. I looked around the room, at the open drawers, the scattered pieces of my life laid bare, and then I understood. I had never been special. I had never been a patient. I had never been anything more than an opening, a doorway, an access point, a vulnerability dressed in need. What she touched wasn't just my skin, it was my life, and I let her in. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night, not the next morning, not a week later, not ever. There wasn't a word that could contain the entirety of it, not deception, not seduction, not even violation. I moved through the days like I was still lying in that bed, naked and stripped of more than just clothing, trying to understand how something that had felt so consuming, so alive, could dissolve into silence. Her absence was immediate, total. The clinic was shuttered 2 days later, closed for restructuring, the sign read, but I knew better. She had taken everything she needed and vanished, as if her body had never been pressed against mine, as if her fingers hadn't once slipped into me like a secret. My husband returned home 3 days after she left. He was tired, sunburned from a business trip, and brought me a keychain shaped like a lighthouse. I took it, smiling with the careful warmth of someone who had memorized all the necessary lines. He didn't notice the difference in me, how quiet I had become, how often I left the room when he entered, how I flinched when he reached for me in the kitchen. I couldn't bear his touch, not because I blamed him, but because I blamed myself. My body had become a place of confusion and betrayal, and I didn't know how to let anyone back in. I started walking in the evenings, long, slow loops around the neighborhood, past familiar houses and trimmed hedges and the low buzz of televisions behind closed windows. My legs ached with each step, but it felt good to move. It felt like punishment and penance and prayer. I told myself I was healing, that this was what it meant to move on. But in the stillness of the night, with the wind pressing against my face and the ache deep in my thighs, I could still feel her, like an echo trapped in muscle memory. My body hadn't forgotten. It responded to shadows, to scents, to the faintest resemblance of her. I hated her for that, and I hated myself more for craving it. I tried to delete her, from my mind, from my muscle, from the tender spot just above my hip where her hand had once pressed so insistently. But she lived in places I couldn't reach, under my skin, in the breathless gaps between dreams. I stopped going to therapy. I stopped answering numbers I didn't recognize. I watched the mail more closely, checked the locks twice before bed. I knew she wasn't coming back, but some irrational part of me feared she might, that she would appear again in another doorway, in another room, with another name, and that I would let her in all over again. One morning, I found a pair of lace underwear buried in the laundry basket. Not mine, not recent. I held them in my hands like they were something alive. I brought them to my nose, and the scent was faint, but it was hers. Clean sweat, lavender, a whisper of something metallic. I held them against my face until I felt sick. Then I tore them in half and shoved them deep into the garbage disposal. I turned on the switch and watched the fabric disappear into steel teeth. I didn't feel better, but I felt something. Weeks passed. The wetness stopped waking me at night. My dreams became ordinary again. Grocery stores, missed flights, forgotten homework. I returned to work, started cooking more elaborate dinners, went through the motions of reconnection. My husband was grateful. He didn't ask questions. He took my renewed interest as forgiveness, not understanding it was survival. He made love to me one night, and I let him. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't pretend. I watched his face as he moved inside me, steady and familiar, and I wondered what he would do if he knew whose name I'd once moaned into the dark, whose fingers had taught my body how to betray him without making a sound. Healing is a strange thing. It's not linear. It doesn't come with relief. It comes in layers, some tender, some rotten, some so stitched into the wound that pulling them out would mean tearing open everything again. I wore that scar beneath my clothes, not just the memory of her, but what she revealed in me, a need, a hunger, a recklessness I had never acknowledged until it was too late. One afternoon, I stood in the shower and ran my hands down my sides, stopping at the soft hollow of my stomach. I pressed gently, remembering how her hand had rested there, how my skin had welcomed her. I wanted to erase the memory, but it was mine. She hadn't stolen that. She had exposed it. I slid my fingers lower, not for pleasure, but to reclaim the geography of my own body. I didn't close my eyes. I didn't rush. I just touched myself until I felt quiet again. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see a victim. I don't see a fool. I see a woman who got too close to something dangerous and let it in. I see a body that still wants, even after betrayal. I see hands that know what to avoid and what to crave and what to never trust again. I tell myself that's what survival looks like. Some days I believe it. Some days I don't.